Good afternoon, one and all. Welcome to a very wet and windy Bramall Lane. We see stuff on the forums about the fabled Desso pitch. We were saying this morning when the rain was howling down on the way into work, it's not that long ago the phones were being meltdown asking if the game was on tonight. If we'll be paddling around in a canoe. Pitch is fine so far. Don't see any problems. Not that my groundsman, of course, but playing surface is spot on these days, even though the weather's bad. Big game again against Brentford tonight, following 2 games last week against our neighbours across the city, of course, and Rotherham on Saturday. And we always try and tie our sort of podcasting to the game in hand. It's not always easy. Down the years with Brentford, of course, a few players have played for both clubs. Most famously, the one that always crops up in my mind is Bob Booker. And Bob needs no introduction to any blade. If you're not young enough or not old enough to see him play, his name sort of rings out throughout. And Bob really epitomises, to me and many others, what it's like to be a Sheffield United player at times. Be the first to admit, not the most skillful or one that stands out particularly, but a career at Brentford that he thought was over. He set out to buy a window cleaning round to pack up before Dave Bassett sent Derek French calling on him. Telling me fancied taking him to Bramall Lane. And Bob tells a great story about it. It's been written loads of times, but he drove up in his clapped-out Fiesta with his dad, Nobby. And the moment he pulled in the car park, he said, "I just couldn't believe me luck." And I always like the story about when he went in to see Derek Dooley about another contract, and Derek gave him another year or whatever, and said, "But this is what we're going to pay you, son." And Bob just said, "That's brilliant," signed it, went away. And he went outside and realised he wanted to thank Derek for what he'd done for him. And went knocked on his door, and Derek shouted, "Come in." Thought he'd come for more money, and said, "Lad, I've told you that's all that's on the table. If you don't want it, don't take it, it's up to you." And Bob went and just wanted to say how grateful I were and how much I appreciate playing for a club of this size and what you've done for Mr. Dooley. Just wanted to thank you. And walked out. Derek were in tears. So never known a football player thank me for a contract ever. But Bob and Brentford and Sheffield United are always fairly synonymous. An event that I missed last week, and it's easy to miss dates, birthdays and stuff like that, was March the 8th. And I was writing a piece for the programme that we'll probably use in a few weeks about who's the greatest player. And it's a very subjective thing, I always think. Your greatest player of your era is the one that means the most to you, obviously. People will argue the greatest in modern history is probably Jimmy Hagan or Tony Curry. I couldn't argue either of those. I never saw Jimmy Hagan play. I was fortunate enough to know him, meet him quite a few times, and I was a bit in awe of him. He was my dad's favourite player, or one of my dad's favourite players. TC, yeah, I did see him play. Probably saw him play after 1971-72. Pretty well every home game he ever played for the club in a few ways as well. But at that age I wasn't old enough to know how great he was. And I've said before, when Dad brought you down to Bramall Lane, a lot of my time was spent running around the Cop. And many of you remember the sort of 2 levels. You had the walkway in between the upper level of the Cop terrace and the lower level. And most of my time was spent playing tiggy with other people around there, or watching the cricket club or supporters club clocks him and get a sausage roll. So I never really understood how great he was. My hero, and I always say it, or one of them, is Keith Edwards. He epitomises to me what it was in my era, watching Sheffield United the first time I went with my mates and went under my own steam. Colin Morris is a big hero of mine. But what I'm trying to get across to you is, who is the greatest player? And everybody will have their own opinion. I'm sure Billy Sharp will force his way into a lot of the more modern fans' affections as they get older, and quite rightly so. Billy's been immense for us, to say the least. But if you rate the greatest player ever of the football club in sheer stats, which is what it's all about, Brian Clough always used to say that he got no qualifications. At school, when people asked him what his qualifications were, he laid out on the table his England caps, his championship medals, things he'd achieved as a football player and a manager, and they were his CV. And I kind of sign up to that. I think long after people are dead and the people that watched them have long gone, the only way you can really judge how great they were is what they achieved. And the history books always tell the truth, more or less. So if that's the case, and you look at a player in terms of what they won, what they achieved and the sheer influence they had on a football club, then it'd be reasonable to argue that one of our greatest players, if not the greatest player of all, was Ernest Needham. Now, Ernest Needham's always fascinated me. He was from Staveley, born in Chesterfield, grew up in Staveley from about the age of 6. And at 16, he was playing for Staveley, not Staveley Miners Welfare. The original Staveley Football Club doesn't exist anymore. They went out of business in the 1890s, but there was a spell around the turn of the 1890s when he was playing that they had a real serious threat of becoming a major team. They used to have a nickname of the Old Foot and Mouth, and apparently that was because the way they played football was quite robust, shall we say, and also that the supporters who followed them weren't slow to give their opinion about what was going on. It was a difficult place to play, and they played at a decent level. You know, they played teams like Forest and Villa in the FA Cup at Staveley to great success. They had a real shot at it. They actually applied to join the Football League, and the application was turned down because the league didn't think that a village the size of Staveley as it was then could provide the support that a league team would need to survive and move on. Same happened to Blackburn Olympic in a slightly different way, back at the same sort of time. And in the end, the death knell for Staveley was the fact that part of the pitch, or the land the original pitch went through, was sold to the railway company. And they took the money and ran. A bit similar to when Wednesday moved out of Olive Grove, to be fair. But at 16, he come to the attention of the County FA, and he played for the Sheffield Glasgow sides. So it was never going to be long before Sheffield United sort of had an eye on him. And he signed just after his 18th birthday in 1891. So at that point, we're not even a Football League club. Now, the skipper of the Blades at that point was a well-known professional called Billy Hendry. And the board of directors at United, realising this fledgling football club they got needed to really adopt professional attitudes, signed Hendry from Preston North End. He played for West Brom as well. And Hendry was born in Scotland. And he's the man who, when you read the old reports of the football club and interviews in the Greenham from the sort of start of the Greenham, 1908-ish, that the original fans of the football club always list Hendry as being one of the most influential people. And Hendry was the man credited with bringing a more professional way of doing things to Sheffield United FC. And Hendry took Needham under his wing. Now, Hendry got injured at one point. It's a great story, 1894. The club had got a Christmas break. Brilliant. And instead of resting the players, they went on a 5 or 6 game tour of Scotland. Unbelievable, by train over Christmas and New Year. Hendry got injured up there and never really recovered from it. And in actual fact, he died down in Brighton, I think, in 1901. So didn't live to old age. Pneumonia, I think he contracted. But what he did was he recognised the leadership qualities in the young Ernest Needham and took him under his wing. And Needham became a colossal influence at the football club. Part of the team that won promotion by way of a playoff, so we do it occasionally, against Accrington into the top flight of football from the old Division 2, of course. We were founder members of that. And when Needham took the armband, the transformation of Sheffield United's frightening. And people often forget, within 10 years of the Blades being formed, and we were always formed to be a major football club, playing at a major stadium to contest major honours. It was never ever a sort of afterthought. We were always part of that master plan. Once Needham started really having an influence, because the captain then would have not only worn the armband, so to speak, he would have had a say in the team selection. Definitely it's a say in tactics. And one of the many things we've got in Needham's career, we've got his captain's handbook, beautifully autographed by the man himself. And one of his roles after the match, the captain must return the ball to the stores. Brilliant. He was responsible for the only football he got. Needham captained the team that won the 1898 League Championship, and also that season became the first ever winners of the Charity Shield after sharing a draw game with the Corinthians. The posh boys thought it was more sporting to award the trophy to Sheffield United, so thanks, we'll have that. Also of the team which were proclaimed champions of Great Britain. Some bright spark in 1898 thought it would be a great idea to take the champions of Great Britain, or champions of England, to play the champions of Scotland in a game to decide who was the best. Celtic won it up there, we won it down here, and in the game we beat Celtic. So I have great pleasure in telling people, still to this day, as it was never played for again, Sheffield United, the reigning champions of Great Britain. He won the FA Cup in 1899 when we beat Derby. He got a cup runners-up medal in 1901 when we lost to Spurs in the replay, and he got another winners medal in 1902 when we beat Southampton. He got his first ever England trial, because in those days England didn't work like it does today. It was very much like cricket, same as Football League to be fair. But you had a panel of selectors, and you'd have a trial game, the possible players v the probable players, and they'd select the full England team from that. And Needham got his first trial game in 1893. Now, what every player wanted to win, the absolute pinnacle, be the top flight player in English football back then, was to be selected for the game against Scotland. That was the cap. You're going to win a cap, it had to be the Scotland cap. And in 1894, Needham got his first cap against Scotland. Now, in his career with England, which is about 9 years, Needham won 16 caps, which these days, when you look at it, is not a great deal, to be honest. Back then, 16 caps meant that he was always selected for England when fit. That's incredible when you think about it. And there were only in those days 3 games a year, the home internationals. Scotland, Ireland and Wales. A little bit later, games against Germany and Denmark started to creep in. But incredible to think that it was an automatic selection for England. Now, at that point, England used to have a balance of professional football players, paid football players, and amateur football players who were the gentry. People like Geo Smith, C.B. Fry, all these great names, C.W. Moon. And Needham reported in some interview I saw with him that he was horrified to find that when he went to England train, or to meet up with England, that the amateur players dined in the dining room on a different table to the professionals. And his relationship was so strong with some of the real prominent amateur players that they agreed with him. You know, they were on a level playing field with them, to quote a phrase, and they should dine on those tables. And Needham was the first ever professional football player to captain his country. Such was the esteem that this halfback was held in by everybody. He was some player, described as well as the complete football player. He had a major hand in everything, to the point where it seems to me, going through our old shares books, that when we went and bought the lane in 1899 from the Duke of Norfolk, and the preferential shares and ordinary shares were issued that people could buy, fascinates me that 30 years after his death, in our shares register book, there are 10 preference shares registered still to Mrs. Needham and his 2 daughters. Now, preferential shares were a big thing for anybody to have in those days. So for Needham to have them, you could sort of argue the fact that he may have bought them. I mean, he was on £5 a week playing for Sheffield United after all, which was a good amount of money in those days. But also, you kind of think that such was Needham's influence on the dressing room and the club in general, that they might have actually given him 10 preferential shares, and quite rightly so. Even more amazing is the fact he was still playing for our reserves until 1910. So quite a while after his football career as a fully fledged first teamer had finished, he was turning out to the reserves at 1912. And we know from our books that, again, such was his influence, he was still registered as a player until 1914. You do the maths, 1873, 27, 37, well into his 40s. Now, when he finished as a player, he scouted for the football club. In fact, one of the players he recommended, and it wasn't a bad decision, he played in a reserve game in 1912 against Leeds City, and a young player tore him inside out, and he thought he was an incredible player. And that player recommended to the board of directors was Billy Gillespie, who would also go on to be one of our greatest ever captains. So he scouted for us, and it's great that when you see reports of going to the 1925 FA Cup final, for instance, it says the grand old figure of Ernest Needham. Well, in 1925, forgive my maths, he'd be 52, I think. When you see photographs of him at Wembley with the team, he looks an old man. And I think that happens a lot. You know, I think about my dad, who's been dead a long time, but even in his early 50s, my dad looked old. And I think people going back did, the way they dressed and their attitude. But why is this significant to what we're saying today in this game? Well, when we were recording the last piece that we did for the game against Rotherham last Friday, I realised when I looked at the dates of his death that he died on March the 8th, 1936. So, however many years that is, I'm not going to be mathematical head on today. That was the date he died, and sandwiched between it, The league game at the start of the month of March, we'd drawn 2-2 here with Charlton. And in between that, we'd beat Leeds United a little bit earlier on, February the 14th, 1936, in the FA Cup 5th round game, which is still the biggest crowd ever at Bramall Lane. 68,287 is in our book for that. On the way from that, we beat Spurs in the next round, in the 6th round, 3-1. Dodds getting 2. And that set us up for an FA Cup semi-final, which we played Fulham at Molineux in March, just after what would have been around the time of his funeral. And I thought it was quite poignant that since the club's birth, it would be the only semi-final that Needham hadn't actually either played in or seen Sheffield United involved with at that point. And this was all triggered off by a friend of mine called Kieran Salt, who was a big blade. I've known Kieran for years, and last week he dropped in a picture, probably the worst football photograph ever, if you're not into stuff like that. But to me it was fascinating. It was a photograph of the Sheffield United directors at Needham's funeral in Chesterfield. Thousands turned out to the funeral when he died. But to sort of conclude the story, it's quite fitting, I always think, that where Staveley Miners Welfare play today, next to it is a cemetery, Staveley Cemetery. If you go into there, you find the burials for 1936, about midway up on your left-hand side, and you walk to the end of one of the rows, you will find the grave, the last resting place of a player that I would argue, based on what he won as a football player here, the only club he ever played for professionally, our greatest, Ernest Needham. And on that tombstone, nobody tends it now, I don't think. There are still some of the family in Staveley, but the further it goes down the line, the more distance it tends to get. There's no mention on that gravestone whatsoever that this was a pioneer of football. This was the first professional captain of his country. This was the man who led Sheffield United to 2 FA Cups and a league championship. An incredible man, an incredible sportsman, and a huge influence on the Red and White Wizards. All it says at the end of the epitaph on his gravestone is a beautiful memory. And I would imagine that by reading those statistics, if you were lucky enough to have seen Ernest Needham playing indeed all that great side of the late 1890s and early 1900s, then a beautiful memory it would have been, because we won everything. And that's still something that this football club is based on today. So I'd never argue with anybody about Jimmy Hagan, who'll be brave enough, one of the greatest players ever to wear this club's colours. Tony Curry as well, Alan Woodward, we can go on forever. But when stats are concerned, and you're dealing in cold hard facts of producing what was the influence on the club and what they actually walked away from the game with, Ernest Needham has got to be right up there. So it's not about Brentford tonight, it's about something I should have done last week, looking at March the 8th, the day we lost our greatest ever captain, you could argue, remembering what he contributed to Sheffield United Football Club, and remembering that also he was part of the team. It was one of the first ones here to be promoted when there's so much left to play for us this season.